instructional video is on reflection notes. To reflect over the x-axis, we first need to identify the line of reflection, which will always be identified in the directions. The x-axis is our line of reflection, or you can think about it as a line of symmetry. We want to take our shape and we want to reflect it across the x-axis. The shape should be exactly the same size and the points should be in the same order, but we're going to flip it upside down. The line of reflection, being the x-axis, should be in the middle of our shape. So you can see that point S is 1 square away from the x-axis. And so when we reflect it across, we are again going to point the S prime position 1 square above the x-axis. So we're just crossing the line and we want it to be evenly split. For point U, you can count from point U to the x-axis is 4 squares. So we will put the new point U prime, across the line 4 squares worth. Same thing for the new point T. Point T is 4 squares away from the x-axis, so I would put the new T prime 4 squares away from the x-axis. When we connect our dots, you can see that it's the exact same triangle, except that it is on the opposite side of the x-axis. It's now upside down. The x-axis line, the line of reflection, is exactly in the middle of all the points. Number 2, we again identify our line of reflection. So the reflection is the y-axis this time. So we're going to identify that y-axis. We want our rectangle shape to go across that y-axis. So if I start at point A is 2 squares away from that y-axis. So I would go again 2 squares across the y-axis and label it A prime. The B point is 4 squares away from the y-axis. So I again would count 4 squares away from the y-axis and label that new point B prime. C is 4 squares away from the y-axis, so my new C point is also 4 squares away from the y-axis. And for letter D, D is 2 squares away from the y-axis, so D prime is also 2 squares away from the y-axis. When you have all of your points plotted, you connect them to reference the same exact shape. The rectangle has not changed, but you can see that it is now backwards. Point A was on the left-hand side, and now point A is on the right-hand side. So the points have changed order because we have reflected it and written it now backwards across the y-axis. Remember, the y-axis line, the line of reflection, is always exactly in the middle of the reflection. We're going to jump to number 4. We're going to reflect over the line y equals 2. So this is not an x-axis or a y-axis. We want to identify the number 2 on the y-axis, and that is going to be our line of reflection. So only touching that value positive 2 on the y-axis. So if I look at point H is 2 squares away from that line. So my new H point, H prime, would go 2 squares across that line. Point E starts off 3 squares away from that line. So I would count 3 squares across the line to make my new E prime. Letter G is 2 squares away from that line. So I would count 2 more squares across the line, labeling that point G. We connect the dots to make the same triangle. It's the same size and the same shape, but you can see that the points are upside down. Point E was up at the top. Now point E is down at the bottom. Flipping paper over on the back, we are now going to identify the lines of reflection. So here we have the original shape, E, G, and H, and we have the second shape, E prime, H prime, and G prime. In order to take point E and plot it to the new E prime, we want to identify the line that is in the middle, because again, the line in the middle is the line of reflection. And we can see that the y-axis is our line of reflection because we can count 1, 2, 3, 4 squares counting to the y-axis, and then another 1, 2, 3, 4 squares across the y-axis. So we would label this as a reflection across the y-axis. For number 2, we are identifying the line of reflection starting with the original shape down at the bottom, A, B, C, and D, and reflecting it to the new shape on top, A prime, B prime, C prime, and D prime. We can count our squares and find that the line in the middle is the x-axis because we can count. Point B is 1, 2 squares to the line, and then 1, 2 squares across the line. The x-axis is right in the middle, and so we would label it as a reflection across the x-axis. For number 3, to identify the line of reflection, we want to pick the line that is in the middle of those two shapes, and that line runs here through the coordinate plane. It is not the x-axis or the y-axis. What you can recognize is that it is located at the value 2 on the x-axis. And so we can realize that point A is 1, 2 squares away from that line, and A prime is also 2 squares away from that line. Since the line is evenly in the middle, we know that that is a reflection across, and then we would label it x equals 2. The x stands for the x-axis, and the 2 stands for the point 2 that it runs through.